It started on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that dissolved into the calendar without any consequence, slipping by without sharp corners or reason to remember it. Jacob Palmer didn't think anything of the date or the gray sky that hung low over the city like a wet sheet. He didn't think anything of the drizzle that soaked his shoulders as he stepped off the bus, or of the quiet hum of traffic that usually made him feel small but safe. Nothing seemed strange. That was the worst part. The footsteps began near the alley behind the market on Elmridge Street. Jacob always cut through it on his way home. It shaved 4 minutes off the walk, and in the late afternoon, the alley was usually empty save for the occasional garbage truck or wandering cat. That day, he stepped into the alley, shoes splashing slightly in the shallow puddles, and that was when he heard them. Light, slow, and unmistakable. Footsteps, soft, following. He stopped walking. So did they. He turned around. No one was there. There was no sound except the distant groan of a bus pulling away from a stop and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. The alley behind him was still, the puddles unbroken. Jacob frowned, telling himself he'd imagined it. Echoes. The slap of his own feet bouncing back at him from the walls. He looked up at the windows above. Some were lit, others dark. Curtains still. No faces. He took another step forward. The steps followed. Behind him, a pace behind, as if someone was walking directly in his wake. Jacob walked faster. The footsteps stayed with him, perfectly timed. He broke into a jog. So did the steps. He spun around again, nearly slipping on the wet asphalt. Nothing. The alley was empty. Jacob stood there for a long minute, his breath visible in the cold air. Nothing moved. The alley remained silent. Just old brick walls, smeared graffiti, a dumpster, and steam rising from a sewer grate. He walked the rest of the way home quickly, refusing to look over his shoulder. Every time he turned to check, the footsteps stopped. Every time he looked away, they returned. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a decaying red brick building with a rusted fire escape that screamed in protest when used. The elevator hadn't worked in years. Jacob took the stairs, heart pounding harder than the climb warranted. When he slammed his door shut and locked it behind him, the sound of footsteps vanished. He stood there in his hallway, shoes dripping on the worn rug, listening. No sound. He was alone. He told himself it had been the alley. The way sounds bounced off stone and echoed strangely. He distracted himself with dinner, ate, while watching the muted flicker of the television. By midnight, The incident had dulled in his mind, replaced with the familiar fatigue of city life and the drone of late-night commercials. He slept with the lights off and the window cracked open, listening to the distant sirens of the sleepless city. But the footsteps returned the next day, not in the alley. This time, he heard them behind him as he walked through the park on his lunch break. A slow, measured cadence, quiet, almost shy. They followed as he passed the old statue near the fountain, where pigeons fluttered and pecked at crumbs. The footsteps were softer than his own, but distinct. No one else was walking near him. He checked more than once. Each time he turned, the steps stopped. He scanned the benches, the paths, the trees. People were around. Couples, joggers, old men feeding birds, but none close enough. None behind him. He felt eyes on him, but when he searched for the source, he found nothing. He left the park early and returned to work, distracted. That evening, the steps followed him from the bus stop all the way to his building. He paused outside the front door, turned suddenly. The street was empty. The footsteps vanished. They followed him every day after that. At first, only outside, on sidewalks, in parking lots, through stores, always just behind him, close enough to feel, not hear, something there. At night, when he climbed into bed, the silence would stretch long and deep. Sometimes he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old pipes and the soft hum of the radiator. But the footsteps stayed away then, or so he thought. A week passed. The weather turned colder. Clouds hung lower. People on the street began to move faster, clutching coats tighter. Jacob stopped using the alley. He took the long way home, but it didn't matter. The footsteps were with him now. They'd moved in. He heard them when he left the bathroom, when he stepped out of the elevator at work, when he took out the trash, always just behind, always stopping when he looked. They never raced, they never hurried, just soft, steady, patient. He began to dread walking anywhere alone. He spent hours trying to recreate the sound, recording his own steps on his phone and playing them back. It wasn't the same. The phantom steps were lighter, almost barefoot, almost naked. He avoided telling anyone. What could he say? That he was being followed by footsteps no one else could hear? That they stopped when he looked and started again when he turned away? He imagined the look on his co-workers' faces. He kept quiet. He searched online, forums, message boards, late-night corners of the internet, where people whispered about hauntings and invisible watchers. Some posts were similar, stories of echoes that didn't match, of presences that followed. Most were dismissed or written off as tricks of acoustics or symptoms of stress. One post stuck with him, a short entry from a now deleted account. They never speak. They only walk. But one day, they stop. That's when you should run. Jacob saved the post, read it again and again, wondered what it meant. He couldn't stop listening. He wore earbuds constantly, trying to drown out the soft steps. It didn't help. The footsteps didn't care about the music. He heard them anyway, faintly, beneath the bass, behind the lyrics. He tried stopping suddenly in crowds to see if anyone bumped into him. No one did. He set up his phone to record behind him as he walked. Hours of footage, nothing but him. No shadows, no figures. But sometimes, in the audio, he heard it. The faint tap of steps not matching his own. His friends noticed his tension. They commented on the dark circles under his eyes, the jump in his voice. He laughed it off, blamed insomnia, long work hours, stress. They didn't press. But Jacob knew. The footsteps were getting closer. He could feel them now, a pressure, a weight in the air. When he turned his head quickly, sometimes he caught the faintest ripple, a blur. Nothing solid, like the afterimage of a shape. He started leaving lights on, all of them. Hall lights, closet light, the bathroom. He slept with a lamp blazing at his bedside, shadows pushed back to the corners of the room. Still, the steps came. He thought about leaving, moving to a different city. But something told him it wouldn't help. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't tied to the alley. It wasn't tied to the park or his apartment or any specific place. It had found him. And it was patient. It didn't need to chase. It walked, always behind. On the 10th day, he called in sick. He couldn't bring himself to leave the apartment. He stayed inside, curtains drawn, doors locked. He didn't hear the steps that day, not once. But the silence felt wrong, not a relief, a warning. That night, he dreamt he was walking in an endless hallway. Each step he took echoed loud and sharp. Behind him, the soft steps followed. He turned in the dream, but even in sleep, he saw nothing, just darkness. When he woke, sweat-soaked and gasping, he swore he'd heard the last echo of a step near his bed. The next day, he left the apartment. He had to. Food was running low, and his phone was nearly dead. Outside, the city moved on as always, indifferent, faceless. He walked quickly, eyes darting to every reflection in store windows, every twitch of movement in his periphery. The steps were back, not louder, not faster, just constant. He cut his shopping short, made it home just as the sun set, locked the door, pulled the curtains tight. He stood in the hallway, breathing shallowly. The footsteps were just outside the door. They didn't knock, didn't try to enter. They just stood there. And after a while, he realized they weren't moving anymore. They'd stopped. That scared him more than anything else. The next morning, there were no steps. Jacob left the apartment hesitantly. The streets were quiet. Normal. Too normal. He walked slowly, waiting for the familiar padding behind him. Nothing. He passed the alley. Still no sound. Crossed the park. Nothing. He stopped walking entirely and stood in the middle of the sidewalk for 5 full minutes. Not a whisper. By noon, the relief began to creep in. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had just stopped. That night, he lay in bed, listening to the silence. Something about it was too heavy, like a blanket soaked in oil, oppressive, watching. The last thought he had before sleep claimed him was that maybe this was what peace felt like after madness. He woke up to darkness. Not the kind caused by night or broken bulbs. It was deeper than that. The air was thick, the silence absolute. He sat up, breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. There were no footsteps, but he could feel something. And then something exhaled beside his ear. Jacob didn't scream. He couldn't. The breath against his ear was soft, almost thoughtful, like someone drawing in the scent of him. His skin erupted in goosebumps, his body locked, not from fear, not entirely, but from some deeper, more primal understanding. Something ancient, coiled in the marrow of his bones, told him to stay still. Do not move. Do not turn. His heartbeat became the only sound in the room, roaring in his ears like waves crashing inside his skull. His eyes scanned the dark, useless. There was no outline, no glow, no movement, but he could feel it. Something was beside him, close enough to touch, close enough to breathe. Then the feeling was gone. No footsteps, no breath, just the normal dark of his room, still and empty. Jacob remained frozen for minutes, maybe longer. Eventually the urge to move returned. He reached blindly for the lamp beside the bed and clicked it on. Light filled the room, weak and yellow. Nothing there, just his cluttered nightstand, the crooked stack of books, the coat slung over his chair. But still, he felt watched, like the shadows were only pretending to be empty. He didn't sleep again that night. The next day, he told himself it had been a dream, the final trick of a mind worn down by too many nights of fear. He repeated that lie throughout the morning, whispering it under his breath like a mantra. Dream. Just a dream. But something had changed. The footsteps returned that afternoon. Only now they were different. They no longer stayed behind him. They drifted, sometimes to his left, sometimes just out of sight to the right. Sometimes they circled him. The sound was still soft, still unhurried, but there was intention in it now. It wasn't following anymore. It was stalking. He began to notice small things, shadows that didn't match their sources, reflections in windows that lagged a moment too long. His phone would unlock on its own, the screen lighting up to the camera without him touching it. Once, he saw something flash across the lens. A smear of color, a shape not quite human. His home wasn't safe anymore. He tried to bless the space, though he had no idea how. He left bowls of salt at the doors, taped crosses to the windows, even burned sage he bought from a woman on the subway. Nothing helped. The footsteps grew bolder. He began hearing them inside, not just behind him, but in other rooms. At night, he'd hear them pacing the living room while he hid under his sheets, clutching the edge like it could protect him. Sometimes the sound came from the kitchen, sometimes from the closet, but never far. One night he woke to the sound of the bathroom sink running. He stood in the hallway for nearly an hour before he got the courage to look. The water was flowing steadily into the basin. No one there. No explanation. Just the soft hiss of water meeting porcelain. He started leaving the television on while he slept. The sound helped, gave him something to focus on, something real. But sometimes the static would shift. The screen would flicker between channels, landing on old programs. Shows from the 70s or 80s, ones he'd never seen before. And in the background of those shows, always in the corners, he thought he saw movement. Something blurry, something wrong. Jacob stopped talking to people. He ignored calls, stopped going to work. His apartment became a fortress of paranoia. Blankets nailed to the windows, furniture pushed against doors. He watched the peephole constantly, convinced something would be on the other side if he blinked too long. He tried leaving the city once, packed a bag, hailed a cab to the train station. But as the cab turned onto the main road, he felt it again, that breath against his neck, that unseen presence. The cab swerved. The driver screamed. Jacob didn't remember the crash, just the sound of glass shattering and metal folding in on itself. He woke up in a hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The driver had vanished. No records of him existed. The name on the cab license was a fake. He never tried to leave again. The footsteps became constant, day and night. When he walked, they walked. When he ran, they ran. When he stood still, they circled. Always just out of reach, always just out of sight. He stopped using mirrors. One morning, brushing his teeth, he caught movement in the reflection. His own mouth wasn't moving, but the mirror showed it grinning, slowly, deliberately, a wide, toothy smile that didn't belong to him. He smashed the mirror with his fist, didn't fix it. He saw that grin again days later, in the reflection of a microwave. Then again, in the glass of a framed photo. It was following him in pieces now, in glimmers. The thing had become braver. He noticed its effects on his body. His hair thinned, skin paled. He lost weight without trying. His hands shook. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought dreams he couldn't remember, only the feeling of being hunted, of being watched from within. He called out once, just screamed into the silence of his home, a raw animal cry, not for help, just for release. The footsteps stopped immediately. Silence fell like a curtain. Jacob didn't know what to do. That night the television turned itself on. Static hissed from the screen. The lights in the apartment dimmed one by one until only the screen remained, glowing faint blue. He stared at it, paralyzed. Images flickered, fast, too fast to make sense. Shapes, faces, his own face, twisting, changing. Then a single frame, something standing behind him in the shot. Tall, featureless, black eyes, mouth open, too wide. Then darkness. When the power returned, all the clocks were wrong. Every single one blinked 3:33 a.m. He didn't move for hours. He stopped eating soon after. Food tasted wrong. Water smelled metallic. He wasn't sure if it was in his head or something else. He grew weaker, thinner, eyes sunken, skin gray. The thing was feeding off him. Of that, he was certain. But it never touched him. It could have. He felt it often. At night, standing over him as he lay in bed. The mattress would dip slightly. The air would go cold, but no hand, no sound. It was waiting for what he didn't know. Sometimes he caught glimpses of it, reflected in the dark television screen, or standing behind him when the hallway lights flickered. A shape, tall, pale, no face, but he never saw it directly. Every time he turned, it was gone. Once, he walked past a stranger on the street who jerked suddenly and clutched his own chest, eyes going wide. The man looked at Jacob with horror, crossed himself, and ran. Jacob didn't stop. He didn't have the strength. The footsteps now were relentless. They no longer matched his pace. They moved when they wanted, regardless of him. Sometimes they were near, sometimes in the ceiling, sometimes beneath the floor, sometimes several sets at once, like there were more than one, like whatever followed him was splitting. He began to lose time, woke up in places he didn't remember going. On a bench outside the bar, in the basement of his apartment building, in the stairwell, fingers bloody from scratching at the wall. Once, he opened his eyes to find himself standing in the alley where it had begun. At night, no memory of how he got there. The air was wrong, too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. He turned slowly. The alley stretched long behind him, and something stood at the far end, not moving, not approaching, just watching. He ran. The steps thundered behind him, not soft, not slow, a stampede of sound. But when he reached the street and looked back, there was nothing, just the alley, still and empty. The silence was becoming unbearable. Louder than sound, he began to hear things in the silence, breathing, whispers, words not meant for him, phrases in languages he didn't understand, names he didn't know. Once a voice rasped something into his ear that made him collapse, weeping. When he tried to remember what it said, he couldn't, just that it hurt. He didn't go near windows anymore. Sometimes he'd see his own reflection watching him from outside, moving differently, smiling. His phone stopped working. Batteries drained in minutes. Computers wouldn't start. When he tried calling someone, anyone, the line would pick up immediately, and a low breathing would echo through the speaker. He smashed the phone eventually. People no longer looked at him. On the rare occasion he went out, strangers would cross the street to avoid him. Children cried when he passed. Dogs growled. One screamed, actually screamed, a long human-like howl of terror. The thing was changing him. He could feel it, not just in his body, but in his mind. Thoughts that weren't his. Dreams of places he'd never been. A tower that stretched into a sky full of ash. A staircase that led down forever. A door that throbbed like flesh. Sometimes he found symbols scratched into his walls. He didn't remember making them. They pulsed when he looked at them too long. One night, he woke up with a symbol carved into his chest, blood dried around it. The footsteps became background noise. Like his heartbeat, he began to expect them. One night, they stopped again. He didn't notice at first. He was lying in bed, light on, staring at the ceiling. Then he realized there was nothing. No steps, no movement. Just stillness. His breath caught. The silence pressed in from every side, thicker than ever before. He sat up, and something exhaled beside his ear again. But this time, it didn't vanish. The presence stayed, heavy, real, closer than ever. He didn't turn his head. He didn't move. The silence stretched, long and unnatural. Then the bed dipped beside him. Wait. Jacob closed his eyes, bracing. Something slid under the blankets, cold as stone, pressing against his side. And a voice, his own voice, whispered in his head, "You're almost ready." Then came the footsteps, but not behind him, inside him. And Jacob understood. He wasn't being followed anymore. He was being made hollow, so the thing could walk in his place. Jacob no longer remembered how long it had been since he'd last heard his own voice. Not the phantom one whispering inside his skull, not the strange echoes crawling under his skin, but his real voice, the one that used to yawn good morning or murmur into late night silence. That voice was gone now, faded and dry, swallowed by the weight inside him. He didn't know where he had been sleeping, or if he had slept at all. Time bent like melting glass. He remembered glimpses, moonlight through a broken window, blood pooled in the corner of a tiled floor, a rusted doorknob turning with no hand to hold it. Something was different now, not quieter, not louder, just final. Jacob rose from the mattress, no longer in his apartment, but in a place that mimicked it with cruel creativity. The walls were his, but wrong. They leaned subtly, like they were listening. The windows no longer opened to the street, but to blackness. Not the darkness of night, just absent. Outside was gone. The thing inside him had stopped whispering. It had grown comfortable. He walked barefoot across the floor, splinters catching on calloused skin. The silence shifted around him, thick with anticipation. The footsteps he had heard for so long were gone, but their absence made their presence louder than ever. He moved through the space like a memory. Doors opened before he reached them. Shadows peeled away as if retreating. The house breathed in sync with his lungs. The temperature never changed, but the air felt colder with every step. He reached the mirror in the hallway, the one that had once cracked under his fist. It was whole now, polished, clean. His reflection was not his. The man in the mirror wore Jacob's face, but slightly off, like a wax figure molded too long under a lamp. The skin sagged differently, the eyes were too dark, and the smile, behind the reflection, the hallway extended into infinity. He turned away. There was no exit, no front door, just endless corridors stitched together with bad geometry, staircases that led to themselves, rooms that rearranged, and always the feeling that something enormous loomed just out of reach, circling, tasting. Jacob felt like a vessel now, full of something thick and crawling. He'd tried, days ago, weeks, to claw it out, to scratch and scream and dig with the edge of broken glass. But it wouldn't leave. It had fused with him, a parasite that no longer needed to hide. Then came the red room. He opened a door he didn't recognize and stepped into it without hesitation. The walls were red, not painted, but red like muscle, like fresh meat. They pulsed, slow and rhythmic. Veins crawled along the ceiling, thick with something dark that moved like mercury. In the center was a chair, wooden, familiar. The chair from his childhood home, the one his mother used to sit in near the fireplace. But this one was soaked through, dripping with something black that hissed where it touched the floor. Something was waiting. He knew, without question, that this was the end of the hallway, the final room, the end of the soundless chase. He sat, and the room welcomed him. The walls contracted, The veins bulged. From the far corner, something peeled itself out of the wall. Long, pale, its limbs too many and too jointed. It moved like a film playing in reverse, jittery and unnatural. Its face was a blank smear, like water-damaged paper. Jacob did not flinch. The thing knelt before him, folding itself into a shape that mocked reverence. Then it reached out, not to harm, not to take, but to offer. In its trembling hands, it held a mirror, small, framed in bone. Jacob took it. The glass shimmered, not reflecting but absorbing. It showed images as if dreaming. His memories twisted. His childhood home swallowed by vine. His friends, eyeless and grinning. Himself, over and over, walking down hallways that turned to throats. And then a door, just a door, wooden, plain, no handle, no markings, but it pulsed like a heart. Jacob understood. He stood holding the mirror, and the room darkened behind him. The thing, the one that had brought him the offering, began to dissolve piece by piece, its skin flaking off like ash in a storm. It didn't scream, it just smiled, impossibly wide as it faded. He walked forward. He found the door easily. It stood at the end of the corridor that hadn't existed before, waiting, wanting. He pressed his hand against it. Warm. The moment his skin touched the wood, the footsteps returned. But they were his now, not following, not chasing, leading. The door swung open without a sound. Beyond was not light or dark, not sky or flame. It was something else, the shape of truth, the geometry of horror. It welcomed him, and Jacob stepped through. They found his body 3 days later in a field outside the city, barefoot and untouched, staring at the sky with wide, glassy eyes. No wounds, no signs of violence, just gone. His heart had stopped. No one knew how he got there. His apartment was empty. No signs of life, no fingerprints, not even his own. Just a chair in the middle of the living room and a mirror on the wall that showed no reflection. They buried him quietly. A small service. Few people came. Most of his friends had stopped hearing from him months ago. His family had long since drifted apart. The pastor read a simple eulogy. They said he'd been troubled, that he'd struggled, but none of them knew. They didn't hear the steps. They didn't feel the breath. They didn't see the thing wear his skin, because Jacob still walked, not in the city, not in any world with streets and traffic and sky, but somewhere else. The footsteps continued, now under his own command. Wherever he walked, silence bloomed like rot, and in every mirror, every screen, every reflection cast by midnight glass, sometimes, just sometimes, you could see his eyes watching from the other side, waiting, not for help, but for the next door, the next vessel. And if you ever find yourself walking alone late at night, and you hear footsteps behind you that don't belong to anyone you can see, don't stop, don't look, because if they ever stop following, it's already too late. The breath will come next, and then the door.